Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream Passion by podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Bruce Chilton. And today we're discussing his book titled Rabbi Paul, an Intellectual Biography. Link to purchase the book in the description. With that being said, I'd like to start us off with this question. Why exactly call him Rabbi Paul?
The background for this had to do with the background of Paul himself. As far as we can see, both from his own testimony and the book of Acts, his background when he was growing up, this is far from the land of Israel in the diaspora, was in fact Judaic. He belonged to some families that were Aramaic speaking in Tarsus, who were also practitioners of Judaism. And because his trade was that of a tent maker, it seems likely that his family also was part of that guild. In antiquity, one did not merely, as a matter of one's own initiative, join a guild. Generally speaking, there was a deep connection. So it was in the case of Paul, and that connection was also to Judaism. As a result of that, he refers to himself as being an Israelite, as also being a Semitic speaker. This makes perfect sense because Jews had actually been settled in Tarsus from the time of Antiochus the Great, who settled them in that area. And therefore, also, Jews enjoyed rights of citizenship, which were extended in the Roman Empire. So Paul's identity as a Jew, as an Aramaic speaker, is beyond question. And he also refers to himself as having attached himself to the teaching of the Pharisees. For someone to do that, who was brought up in the diaspora, was an act of commitment. And in order to realize that commitment, Paul or anyone else would have had to master the traditions of the Pharisees. Pharisees were known for their competence in oral tradition, which they held went all the way back to the time of Moses. When one was a person who had mastered that oral tradition, he became addressed as others within that movement as rabbi, which is an Aramaic term, which means my great one. That is, someone whose status is in advance of my own. It was with exactly that kind of status that Paul was in Jerusalem as a Pharisee when he had his first contact with the movement centered on Jesus, which was not at all, of course, to join to that movement. It was rather to persecute that movement. Why ever would you persecute Christianity? Well, the answer was that they were not holding to exactly that precious oral tradition, which Paul, as a master of that tradition or rabbi, had spent his life until that point in order to achieve. After that point, of course, as an apostle, he then becomes well known for his ability to render the message concerning Jesus orally, which of course he also did with extraordinary mastery, as we can see reflected in his letters. So all of those considerations bring themselves together to make Paul appear as a master of oral tradition. First, the oral tradition of the Pharisees, and later, the oral traditions of what became Christianity. Need to bear in mind that the term rabbi in the first century was used just as I just referred to it, namely as a way of paying deference to someone else as having mastery of a given tradition. It did not imply there being some kind of formal curriculum which was followed somewhere in order, as we later would say, to be ordained as rabbi. The idea of ordination as we know it in both Christianity and Judaism did not exist at that time.
What kind of Pharisee do you think Paul was? Do you think he was a typical Pharisee or some other kind?
The dedication of the Pharisaic movement was towards a conception of purity. And the reason for which they held purity as central was that purity was defined as what was consistent with worship within the temple. So the conception was that the Pharisee in one's personal life or the Pharisee's family, since most of them were in a family setting, would maintain a concern for purity that would make them fit for the kind of participation they were qualified for inside the temple. Keep in mind that at that time, qualification for entry into the temple was largely a matter of birth. That is, that if one was genealogically from the priests, that assumed one kind of involvement. If not, one could not have an immediate relationship to sacrifice. And yet, there were requirements of purity that had to be met for one even to be an observer in the vicinity of the altar inside the temple. Pharisaism was dedicated to the proposition that, especially within Jerusalem, there ought to be a concern for purity that was consistent with the worship that it was the very purpose of that city to fulfill. For this reason, we, for the most part, encounter Pharisaism in association with the temple and with Jerusalem, as one would expect. However, over the course of time, there was also a radiation of the movement outward from Jerusalem so that it could affect other areas. First of all, within territorial Israel, and then over time, much further than that. And because Paul refers to himself as dedicating himself to the way of the Pharisees, that indicates that even in the diaspora in Tarsus, this concern for purity had been contributed by the Pharisees, so that enthusiastic people who wanted to commit themselves with zeal to Judaism might very well take this path.
What do you think caused Paul to go from being a Pharisaic Jew persecuting Jesus' followers to somebody that claimed to have a vision of Jesus and just switched sides and did a full 180 degrees?
This, of course, is one of the great key moments within the entire arc of Paul's development, intellectually and biographically. The part of Paul's identity that caused him to persecute Christians is, I think, fairly straightforward to understand. That is, as someone who is interested in purity and the temple, he was not only skeptical, but also in opposition to anyone who would impugn the purity of the temple itself. Now, this was something that Jesus of Nazareth had actually done. He had entered into the temple with supporters in order to remove animals which were for sale, for sacrifice, and their vendors. And his claim, Jesus' claim in doing that, was that the space was not sufficiently pure. Paul, as someone dedicated to the temple, sided rather with the point of view of the high priest, Caiaphas, who saw Jesus as a danger. That was one of the reasons for the crucifixion, that Caiaphas denounced Jesus to Pilate as being the source of a riot inside the temple, a riot that Romans were very concerned with because the Romans treated the temple as their own purview. Obviously, Romans could not enter in order to worship, but the Roman emperor arranged for sacrifices every single day in the temple, offered, of course, by the priests of Israel, but on behalf of the emperor. It became a symbol for the Romans of their pacification of Jerusalem. As a consequence, any kind of riot in the temple would draw the deep concern of the Romans, who wanted to see that it was not repeated, and that if there were any criminal activity, it was dealt with. So that was the reason that Caiaphas and the Roman administrator, Pontius Pilate, made their common cause and saw to the execution of Jesus. The involvement of Paul was only in question after that point. There's no indication in the texts of Paul himself that he personally knew Jesus. In fact, quite the reverse. He says he didn't know Jesus according to the flesh, as he puts it. He is opposed to the followers of Jesus precisely because they claimed that actually it was Jesus' view of the right use of the temple, which was consistent with purity, not that of the high priest. In other words, the contention between Jesus' point of view and Caiaphas' point of view continued after Jesus' death because his followers believed he was living again and directing their movement. Now, this is when we come to the moment of Paul's conversion, when he is in the very midst of persecuting Christians. Now, the most famous versions of this story, there are several of them, appear in the book of Acts, and they appear with a great deal of circumstantial detail, and there is reasonable discussion about which, if any of those details, we should take seriously. One thing, however, is plain from Paul's own writing, and that is that he was in the midst of persecuting Christians, that is, denouncing them to the authorities, when the unthinkable happened. Namely, as he puts it, God decided to uncover his son within me, to remove a covering that permitted Paul to see that the very figure he had been persecuting, in fact, offered a correct understanding of what worship in the temple was for. What was this big change? There too, Paul explains to us what went on. And he does this in his letter to the Galatians, which gives the most precise internal account of not only the resurrection, but the before and the after of the resurrection. The resurrection itself is, as Paul says, that moment when it pleased God to uncover his son in me, he says. That is, he comes to see within himself that there is a center of human personality that reveals the will of God. That's, for him, exactly the vision of the resurrection. And he refers to it as being a vision several times. The before of that vision is that as a persecutor, he had insisted that the way to define purity in association with the temple was on the basis of the laws of Judaism as kept by the Pharisees. But then the resurrection, his experience of Jesus as alive and in him, convinces him that actually the purpose of the temple is to guard a purity such that it can become, in the words of Isaiah, a house of prayer for all nations. That is, that people generally, not only genealogical Israelites, had a place within the worship of Israel in the temple. That conviction then causes Paul completely to change the direction of his life. Until that time, everything had brought him to Jerusalem, right? He had made his way from Tarsus to Jerusalem with the aim of remaining within that orbit for as long as he possibly could for the rest of his life. From the time of his experience of Jesus as raised from the dead, he heads away from Jerusalem towards those outside of Israel in order to convey the message that they also were part of this movement to make the temple a house of prayer for all nations. This is what makes him the apostle of the Gentiles, as he himself puts it.
Do you think that Paul classified himself as an apostle to the Gentiles because he knew that trying to convert Torah Orthodox Jews to his position would be difficult and almost impossible in several cases?
Now, this is a very good question, and it's one that shows us that for all that Paul was passionately commitment to his own priorities, he could also become aware of there being very important political and cultural and biographical constraints. When he talks about his own experience of Jesus as alive again, he refers to the rumor circulating that, as he puts it, the person who used to persecute us has now joined us. And naturally, there was skepticism about Paul's own faith, skepticism on the part of followers of Jesus beforehand, some of whom had been persecuted by Paul, and also skepticism by those in Jerusalem who were faithful to the Pharisaic movement. Here, they had made room for Paul coming in from the diaspora, from Tarsus, inside their group in Jerusalem. And now suddenly he is stating their view of purity is wrong. And actually, the way of purity announced by Jesus had been correct. This did not put him in a good position to argue with those within Judaism whose first dedication was to keeping the Torah. So Paul actually came to an agreement with other apostles that there should be different emphases, so that one of the leaders of the movement at this time, James, the brother of Jesus, took up his position in very close association with the temple itself, where he practiced the Nazirite vow and also encouraged others to take up the Nazirite vow. James's understanding was that you could live in purity in very close proximity to the temple, maintaining the teaching of Jesus and yet also practicing traditional Judaism. On the other hand, Peter, who is probably today the best known of the apostles, takes up his particular method of evangelization, which is to interact not only with Jews, but also with those in Gentile communities who already had shown their sympathies with Judaism. These people were called God-fearers or God worshippers. And some of them actually went along to synagogues and joined in listening to the Torah and to practicing some of the teachings of Judaism alongside genealogical Israelites, even though they continued to be Gentiles. Peter had a hearing among this group too. Paul, on the other hand, really finds his identity within the movement when he is associated with another apostle named Barnabas in order to deal with something unusual that happened in the city of Antioch. In Antioch, people who were themselves not Israelites and had not earlier shown a strong affinity to Judaism, nonetheless began to proclaim their own faith in Christ. And this struck the wider population of Antioch as being very difficult to explain. Why is it that these people who had no connection with the traditions of Israel should show themselves loyal to this person whom they called Christos, Messiah, or anointed, whom in fact had been executed by the Romans under Pontius Pilate? And in fact, we can tell how surprised they were by the word they invented in order to refer to this movement. They, in Antioch, were the first people recorded who referred to what they called Christianoi, Christians, which means partisans of Christ. That is, they treated them as if they were some kind of political party. The term Christianoi is similar to Caesarianoi, that is, partisans of Caesar. What it shows is that Christianity emerged as a puzzling movement exactly at the moment that it showed its appeal to those who were outside the orbit of Judaism. But for Paul, that was exactly the cutting edge of the message about Jesus, because it meant that there you could find a way to make the temple in Jerusalem a house of prayer for all nations. You could actually bring them in to the circle of those for whom God wished to exercise his deliverance.
Do you think that Paul viewed himself as being faithful to the Torah, despite the fact that in arguments that he had, like in Galatians, when he confronts James and Peter, especially Peter, when he says, I converted him to the face, and all over the matter of circumcision?
All over the matter of circumcision, and he accuses Peter and even Barnabas of hypocrisy. And the reason for this, as you suggest, relates to the issue of circumcision in particular, which proves to be a defining issue for Christianity. But then that defining issue, once it is confronted, then leads to another issue. So let me refer to both of them. First, on the issue of circumcision in itself. Let's join in a thought experiment and ask ourselves, how is it that someone who had nothing whatever to do with Judaism would actually join the circle of faith that's related to Jesus in such a way that they would be an inclusion of that person within the promises of God made, after all, to Israel. One point of view held very simply that those who joined themselves to Jesus, wherever they were, whatever their practices had been, would have to take up the practices of Judaism as a whole. And that would include maintaining what is called in the Torah the sign of the covenant, namely male circumcision on the 8th day of life. And I would wish to stress that there were Christians in the first century who practiced this, and it continued. It continued to the 2nd century, to the 3rd century, to the 4th, to at least the 7th century of the Common Era. That is, it is a straightforward, in my opinion, common sense position to say that Gentiles who join themselves to the movement are to keep the laws of Judaism. However, it turned out, and precisely because of experiences in Antioch, this very place we've been talking about, it turned out that a meeting of the leadership of the movement occurred in Jerusalem, which was under the leadership of James, the brother of Jesus, more than anyone else, though it included Barnabas and Paul and Peter and others of the disciples and apostles of Jesus. They decided that circumcision should not be required. Rather, the method of inclusion was to be by means of baptism. And this is where baptism acquires a distinctive position inside Christianity as being a gateway ritual of identity within the movement. Once you've said that, I want to emphasize that the leadership in Jerusalem was agreed on this point, including James, the brother of Jesus. The record is quite clear on that point. And I emphasize that because there's been a tendency in discussion to treat James as if he supported universal circumcision for believers. He did not. The reason one can gather that impression is because of the way Paul used language, as you rightly say, in the letter to the Galatians. Because in Galatians, Paul has to face up to the issue not of circumcision, but of something that is related to circumcision. Namely, if we have believers, because of baptism, some of whom come from genealogical Israel, right? Their parents and their parents before them have kept the law for as far back as they could recollect. They themselves are dedicated to the law, and they believe in the anointed. That's straightforward. But then you also have a group who are not by genealogy and not by ordinary practice describable of belonging to Judaism. Some of them may know something about it. Most of them probably don't, especially in Antioch. How should we treat those people in relation to those who have kept and have always kept the Torah? One really easy, and again, I would say common sense method, is to say you keep such groups separate. Because evidently, for example, as concerns laws about dietary regulations, there are always going to be ways in which those who stay true to the Torah are going to be distinct from those who don't even understand that Torah. And that's what the major controversy in Galatia concerned, namely whether those who had come from Israel genealogically and those who had come from the Gentiles by means of baptism should be eating together, should be joining in common meals. Incidentally, those common meals would include Eucharist, although they would not be limited to that. This is why Paul there in Galatians becomes furious, because as he recounts it, although James had not required circumcision of believers, he nonetheless thought that the two communities, one defined by Torah, the other not, should be kept separate. And Peter and Barnabas, having thought they should be united in table fellowship, then went for separation. This is what causes Paul to accuse them of hypocrisy. And the fallout of that is considerable. It means that Paul sets himself up over and against James, over and against Peter, even over and against Barnabas, who had introduced him to apostolic work. And in pursuing why it is he thought this was the case, Paul also, for the first time in Galatians, publicly articulated the most radical, I think, of all of his positions. In order to explain why it was in his mind that not only could those who were Torah practitioners and those who were not only could they eat together, but they really had to eat together, was that, as he put it, when any person is baptized, when any person believes in God with faith, that person becomes, at that moment, a child of Abraham and therefore one of Israel. In other words, Paul contradicts the ordinary genealogical understanding of Israel, and he says that genealogical understanding has to withdraw in favor of an understanding that Israel is defined entirely by means of faith. If you believe in Christ, you've become a child of Abraham, and therefore you are Israel, even though you haven't kept the law, even though you don't commit yourself to maintain the law in all of its detail. That is, I think, Paul's single most radical idea, an idea so radical that it wasn't accepted in his lifetime. And although later Christianity became a majority Gentile movement, and later they also embraced Paul as being a principal authority of Christianity, still the idea of Israel being not genealogical, not the religion of a people, in fact, never became normative within Christianity.
We have a super chat question. JC, thank you for your super chat. Why might they reseal a revelation of the relationship between the crocus, physics, petal, talpiot, rosette, and the cuneiform terms for crocus, saffron, kurgiron, and some azuperu to add? Not exactly sure what that has to do with this topic, but
well, it does relate tangentially to Caiaphas in the sense that the whorl rosette was used as an element of decoration on the ossuary of Caiaphas, the high priest at the time of the crucifixion. And Caiaphas' ossuary, the limestone box with bones inside it, was discovered in Jerusalem, in Talpiot, and it actually had the name of Caiaphas twice on the limestone box. And it had his name correctly, that is, as Joseph Caiaphas, not simply as Caiaphas. So that suggests to us that the reason for this whorl rosette associated with Caiaphas was because he was high priest. And the descriptions that there are of temple decorations also indicate that these rosettes, these floral patterns, are widespread in association with high priestly practice. They're also a method by which Masons were able to show their particular skill, that these are not just plain boxes, they're not just limestone boxes, which are inked, which you'll also find, but also with quite refined floral decoration. And everything we see in literary terms, for example, from Josephus, indicates that this pattern was taken up. Now, having said that, the method of carving that we can see associated with Caiaphas and other ossuaries is not as refined or sophisticated as some earlier masonry work from the cuneiform period and until the time of Second Temple Judaism.
Oh, I was muted. Thank you for
Yes,
your
right.
super
Thank you. I was about to comment.
JM. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for your super sticker, JM, and the thumbs up. So do you think that does Paul's other letters indicate that he eventually came to recognize that his sharp disagreement with people like Cephas, John, and James was much greater than he had originally anticipated, or do you think he was always consciously aware that there were very serious disagreements?
This is a very good question. I think that he was aware of the disagreements intellectually in real time, that is, as they happened. And he also knew that within those disagreements, he himself had changed positions radically. So you have that change from persecutor to ultimately apostle, from someone who is true to the traditions of Pharisaism to someone who says anyone who believes is by the act of faith a child of Abraham. He sees that change, and those alterations in him he attributes to revelations, to uncoverings by God inside his own life. But over the course of time, he becomes aware of the emotional cost that there is for this kind of deep disagreement. Very often at the time, he portrays himself as being amazingly self-assured to the point of being arrogant. So, for example, when he says in Galatians, when Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. I mean, this is not the attitude or the language of someone who's really trying to make peace or find harmony. Is rather staking out a position. And the reason for that is I think that he's constantly exploring to discover what his position is. And as he progresses, what he attempts to do, once he has this important confrontation in Antioch that we've just referred to. He increasingly works on his own, but even on his own, when he goes to a new village or town or city in order to preach the message, to establish communities, he inevitably runs across others who also believe in Jesus, who may well have been influenced by James and Peter and Barnabas, or another very important figure from Alexandria named Apollos. He names all of them in his correspondence with the Corinthians in Greece. So he knows very well that they're influential, that he doesn't fully agree with them, and that this is resulting in differing practices within differing communities. And then, because of that experience, he begins to explore his conception of what he calls the body of Christ. Body of Christ is picked up by Paul to some extent because the idea of there being a widespread body, a single whole that subsumes life itself, was very dear to the Stoic philosophy. And Stoicism was very popular in the Greco-Roman world in this time, and Stoicism was extremely influential in Tarsus when Paul was growing up. So he takes this emblematic Stoic idea of the body and refers to the body of Christ, the idea that there's a unity, there's a connection that binds us together even when there are distinctions, and that we need to recognize, especially when there are disagreements. So Paul, in my opinion, when he comes to this more emotional realization, becomes heroically dedicated to the idea of finding unity. However, that's something that occurred just as Christianity itself was falling under the scrutiny increasingly of Roman magistrates, nothing to do with Christianity, but agents of the Roman Empire who saw Christianity as being a disturbance that needed to be dealt with, that needed to be suppressed. And Paul came victim of precisely that in Ephesus, the city where he had set up a reasonably stable center of operations for a number of years. It's unusual for this persistent traveler that he found a place that he liked. It was Ephesus, but then finds himself expelled by the city because of his success and because the Roman magistrates saw him as being a disturbance. And that led Paul on the final quest of his career, which was both the most audacious and, I think, in its result, the most tragic. And that is that after having to leave Ephesus, he decides that the only way for him to express the way in which he believes that Gentile and Torah observance belong together in one single Israel, what he called the Israel of God. The only way to express that was to take up the offerings of all those who believed in Jesus in the diaspora, to go to Jerusalem and to arrange there for a sacrifice on their behalf. He calls this the offering of the nations, of the Gentiles. And for this purpose, he persistently writes to the communities that he had known well, and he writes to some communities that he was just getting to know, urging them to contribute to this great act, which in his view would make for one single Israel, derived from both genealogical Israel and also from the nations. And so he writes in particular in his letter to the Romans of how he intends to fulfill that mission to offer the sacrifice of the nations in Jerusalem, and makes his way to Jerusalem with that purpose in mind. Arrives there as tensions in Jerusalem have increased considerably since the last time he had visited the city. He had visited the city after his resurrection experience several times, but then there was a lapse of many years until he returns under the time of the procuratorship of Felix and later Festus, when there is an increase of tension within Jerusalem between the Romans and the native population. This is in the period leading up to the Great Jewish War. That war broke out in the year 66, but the fact is that there had been increasingly unrest prior to that time, in the very late 50s, when Paul arrived in order to try to make this offering of the Gentiles. In Jerusalem, he actually makes his peace, as much as he ever did make it, with James, the brother of Jesus. Because James, who, as I said, was in Jerusalem leading the practice of people making Nazirite vows, James actually offers to Paul the possibility of conducting some of James's Nazirites into the temple and to make an offering there, which would in fact fulfill the gesture that Paul wanted to accomplish. As it turned out, however, Paul's reputation preceded him, and as sometimes happens, his reputation took over from what he was actually doing. He was in Jerusalem to offer a sacrifice correctly with Nazirites prepared by James, and in doing so, to represent those offerings on behalf of the Gentiles, because after all, they had actually financed them. However, Paul had become known in the heated environment of Jerusalem as a renegade. And therefore, when he entered into the temple, the rumor broke out amongst the people who were worshiping there that, in fact, Paul was bringing Gentiles directly into the temple, which was a violation not only of Judaic law, but also of Roman law. The result was a riot. And in the course of the legal proceedings, Paul appealed for judgment in Rome, and that led to a journey that took him eventually to Rome. Sadly, it brought him there so that in the year 64, when there was a major pogrom against Christians, which was unleashed by the Emperor Nero, Paul met his death. So it was a matter of achieving the result that he wanted to, but with consequences that he could not have predicted.
What did Paul expect to take place during judgment, during the second coming of Jesus?
Paul has got the most detailed explanation there is of what is to occur at the end of time, which is to say, at the very end of human life. And he lays this out in his letter to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians chapter 15. That chapter does two things at once. One is it sets out an understanding of what the resurrection of Jesus is. I referred to Galatians as the best explanation Paul gives of what it was like for him, for Paul. But in 1 Corinthians, he talks about resurrection in its own terms, that first. And then second, in 1 Corinthians 15, he also relates what the resurrection of Jesus is to human destiny in itself. And that's what takes us to the end of time question. And these two, Jesus' resurrection and human destiny, they're mutually relating in Paul's understanding. He believes that we should not understand the resurrection of Jesus as being of a physical body. He doesn't use the term physical for this. He talks about body of flesh, soma sarkikon. He says he's not soma sarkikon because flesh dies. He also says it's not even a body as infused with soul, soma sukikon, because a body with soul also dies. It's rather interesting. Paul does not believe in the eternity of the soul. He thinks souls die too. He knows very well the word for soul in Greek, psyche, and in Hebrew, nephesh, means breath. We all know that breath goes away. That's what death is. So Christ's body in the resurrection was neither flesh nor soul. It was rather, he says, spiritual body. So that there is a change in the medium of existence. And that's why, if I go back to Galatians, that's why Paul can say there so briefly, without explanation, when it pleased God who separated me from my mother's womb to reveal his son in me. How can we speak about a revelation inside? Well, the answer is revelation of a spiritual body, as he goes on to explain in 1 Corinthians 15. Now, having said that, in the same chapter, Paul goes on to say that this also is the template of how it is that human beings are to be. And he explains this by referring to the way in which we can all be compared to the first human being, Adam. In Hebrew, Adam means man of earth. And Paul says, well, this was the earthly Adam. And we're all like the earthly Adam. And like the earthly Adam, all of us die in the way that Adam did. But there is also a second man. There is also a spiritual template. So the purpose of the final transition that human beings make is to make a change into a medium of an entirely spiritual body. Now, in saying this, Paul refers to others beside himself who had experienced Jesus as alive after the crucifixion. But he doesn't attribute his own views to them. Paul, in fact, goes out of his way to say that all of those others saw Christ before me. I only came to this at the very end. And so he appears to acknowledge, and this goes back to one of your earlier questions, he appears to acknowledge that in this regard, too, he is an unusual thinker, but he's also a committed one. He doesn't show any sign of a lack of confidence in saying that this is the nature of resurrection, both for Christ and also for all those who are connected with Christ.
We have a super chat question. Michael E., thank you for your super chat. How do we know that Paul was executed?
We only know from later sources. That is, as you probably know, the book of Acts leaves Paul in Rome in the period prior to his execution. And in fact, it refers to a period in which Paul enjoyed a relative degree of liberty. He was able to move about, although he is still in effect under what amounts to house arrest. The book of Acts leaves Paul there at that stage because it chooses to end the story at a relatively good moment in the relationship between the church and the Roman Empire. Had it continued any further, then it would have to talk about the pogrom of Nero, which means the death of Peter, the death of Paul. Now, I just mentioned the death of Peter. How do we know about that? That is only related to us in later literature, which refers to how it was that Peter was executed. The same is true of Paul, that we do not have from the New Testament relatively good historical information about that. It does come to us from a later period. In analyzing that sort of information, that is, a statement which is made at a later time, the best way forward, which is followed by most historians, is to see whether it's consistent with what we do know from more direct historical sources. For example, because there's no further reference to Paul thereafter, or for that matter, to Peter. The same thing occurs to us in the case of James, the brother of Jesus. There we have to rely on Josephus and Hegesippus. We are in a similar position as concerns Mary Magdalene. We can't specify the moment at which she died, and yet Mary Magdalene appears to have been living in Galilee shortly after the outbreak of the Jewish war. And we do know that the 10th Legion Fretensis deliberately went into Tiberias and the surrounding villages and executed people who were not young enough to be sold into slavery. So the question of the deaths of these figures very often has to be a matter of inference.
What is the connection between 4th Ezra and Paul's view of the Messiah?
The conception in the fourth book of Ezra, in chapter 7, I think it's verse 28, has the picture of the Messiah and those with him appearing. And Paul uses similar language in that chapter I just referred to in 1 Corinthians 15. That is, it refers to the revelation of Christ in his spiritual body and those who are with Christ in his appearing. So I would say it's a very good question because there is a similarity in the understanding that there is a prototype for what resurrection is. And in referring to that prototype, we can use the language of Messiah, of the anointed. This is happening in 4th Ezra. This is happening in 1 Corinthians 15. It may possibly be happening within the Dead Sea Scrolls, but that is still a matter of considerable controversy. The issue that the term Mashiach is used in the Dead Sea Scrolls, Mashiach in Aramaic, Mashiach in Hebrew, but the extent to which it refers to such a prototypical figure, that I think is not clear. I would not say that's categorical. But it is categorical within the fourth book of Ezra, and therefore also within the second book of Baruch. And those two writings are close enough in time to Paul's writing to the Corinthians as to suggest that we are dealing with a understanding within Second Temple Judaism of how general resurrection is disclosed through a prototypical figure. And for Paul, Jesus Christ is exactly that figure.
And in my closing question, can you tell us a bit about Paul's exorcism at Ephesus?
Yes, it is remarkable how the book of Acts, which is widely considered not to be an historical source, but to be something of the nature of a romantic novel, nonetheless sometimes will provide us with information which seems to illuminate the context of many of the actions that take place. So, for example, in the case of Peter, there's the story of Ananias and Sapphira, two figures who failed to disclose their full financial picture, who claimed to have given all they had and did not, and who suffered death as a consequence. We would not have known of the severity of judgment against those understood to be wealthy by deviousness without a story of that kind. And so it is in the case of those in Ephesus who tried to function as exorcists and did so by telling people that they were going to cast out their demons by means of the Jesus preached by Paul. And the result of that is a complete disaster because they aren't Paul. They aren't actually representatives of Jesus, and therefore they end up being stripped and beaten up by the demons concerned. Now, I want to emphasize the story of Ananias and Sapphira is exaggerated. The story about the exorcists preaching, exorcising in the name of the Jesus preached by Paul seems to be legendary. But it's telling us about the ethos of early Christianity in both cases. And in the case of Paul, it's reminding us that although we think of Paul primarily as being a preacher, he also says himself that he engaged in signs. And according to Acts, one of those signs included exorcism.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Professor Chilton.
It's been good as always. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and/or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during the live stream. Thank you.